Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the second part of your You Judge activity. And this time, let us immediately proceed to the next item. This is a social experiment. So, in the Milgram experiment, the researcher used, take note, bogus electric shocks to measure the extent to which people would submit to authority to inflict pain on another person. However, the electric shocks were not real. That is why it's called bogus here. So the situation here was that the researchers asked somebody, okay, to hurt another person. Otherwise, if they won't do it, they will be given electric shocks. However, the electric shocks were believed to be just bogus, or they were not real. So, does this actually constitute an ethical research practice provided that it's not even true? The question is absolutely not. Even though you did not inflict physical pain to your research participants, and yes, this is a social experiment, still, it has something to do with emotional pain or duress, okay, or an action that is being brought onto someone to do something against their will or better judgment. And so, if you inflict a particular psychological pain or suffering to your research participants, still this constitutes the violation of the principle of non-maleficence. Okay, and also who will benefit from that, right? So this was deemed unethical. Yes, that actually happened. Next one. In 1955, researchers in Wichita studied jury deliberations, professionals, to look at group decision making and negotiating. The participants, or the juries, were not told that they were being observed and videotaped as to preserve the natural mechanisms of their decision making. Now, the key argument here is that if somebody is actually observing you, then there's this tendency not to act so naturally. And so their argument was that, okay, let's not tell these professionals, these juries, that they were being observed so they could act naturally during the data gathering process. Now, does this actually constitute an ethical practice or not? Of course not. It's not the argument that I mentioned earlier, the preservation of natural state, will never fly or will never hold water in research ethics. Especially the fact that the juries, these professionals, were not given consent and they were actually videotaped. It would have been better if the researcher first asked for a consent from them and then recorded just their voices. That is actually a better data gathering procedure, other than videotaping them, like seeing their faces, in the video. That's purely unethical. So don't you ever do it, especially if there's no consent. Okay. Next one. This one is really interesting. Carolyn Ellis published her research of two Eastern Virginia fishing communities in her book Fisherfolk, Two Communities on Chesapeake Bay in 1986. Now, there are two premises. She had obtained informed consent at the beginning of her research. She stayed in the field for several years, that many community participants claimed they had forgotten she was researching them and had begun to think of her as simply a friend. Now, are there unethical practices here, or is this purely ethical? Take note, she had obtained informed consent from the research participants. However, because she stayed there for a very long time, because she's an ethnographer, okay, they forgot that they were actually being researched about. So, is this ethical or not? Oh, did you guess that one right? This research was deemed unethical by the juries. Why? Simply because since this is ethnography or a qualitative approach to research, there is a need for respondent concordance. And so when the books were actually published, the research participants complained, okay, and they claimed that they didn't know that the the discussions or the stories that they shared to Miss Ellis were actually treated as data for her research. And so, respondent concordance was not done at all. So, observations may be criticized if people do not know or have forgotten they were being observed. Critics assume that the data collected in the study were gathered from respondents that regard the researcher as a friend. And so, authenticity is definitely in question. So, as researchers, and should you indulge in quantitative, qualitative, or mixed methods type of research, you have to make sure that your participants know that they are being researched on and you are still on to your data gathering no matter how long you've been there. Okay, it is your job to remind them constantly that everything that you do is part of the research data gathering. Up next, let's see what the next is. Researchers interviewed several participants about illegal drug use. Since signing a consent form and putting the participants' names on a legal document could imply their admission to drug use, the researchers obtained verbal consent and not a signed consent. Now, the main question here is, can signed informed consent be waived in times like this? Is this ethical or not? Yes, for the first time we have an ethical type of research practice. Why? Just like what we have established in the research scenario, if you force or if you require your research participant to sign a document that would imply admission to something, let's say being a criminal, being an ex-convict, or being a drug dealer or something of that sort, then you can actually waive the signed informed consent. Instead, you can just obtain from them a verbal, an oral consent that they want to participate in your research. Question: can you actually record their voices? That is definitely okay, as long as you do not just divulge it to public. Okay, so you may obtain a recorded informed consent. So that's the main point of this particular research practice. Next one. Here we go again with ethnography. Ethnographers observing several sufficiently public places reasoned out that they do not need to obtain a signed informed consent, since first, it is impossible to get consent from everyone who is present, and second, there is no reasonable expectation of privacy in those places. This is another example of, is waiving a signed informed consent fine in some cases? The answer is ethical. Yes, if it is really a sufficiently public place, just like in the market, you do not control the number of people who go to the market. If it's a park, if it's a real public place, then definitely you do not have to get a signed informed consent. However, should you be observing public places like this, you have to observe from a distance. And even if consent is waived, researchers are still expected to treat participants in an ethical manner. So if you only need to observe the participants from a distance, then so be it. Do not go near them and just observe the public place as a general, not per person who is actually in there. So that constitutes the second part of our You Judge activity. Please stay tuned for the last part of the corrections or the key to corrections for this particular formative assessment. Thank you.